Have you ever felt the quiet suspicion that there has to be more to life than the grind of ordinary days? More than routines that repeat, more than noise that never stops, more than a world that keeps demanding your attention but rarely gives you peace in return. Most people are not starving for information. They are starving for direction. They want to know how to live, how to love, how to endure loss without becoming bitter, how to succeed without losing their soul, how to face conflict without being consumed by it, how to be steady when everything around them feels unstable. That is why the Sermon on the Mount still matters. It is not a collection of sentimental sayings. It is not a set of motivational posters. It is the concentrated teaching of Jesus that confronts the deepest assumptions of the human heart and replaces them with a new reality. In the Gospel of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount appears as a unified body of teaching in chapters 5 through 7, shaping what it means to live under the reign of God. The scene opens with something simple and unforgettable. Jesus sees the crowds. He goes up on a mountain. He sits down. His disciples come to him. Then he begins to teach. Do not rush past that moment. In the ancient world, sitting to teach signaled authority. It was the posture of a teacher who was not guessing, not experimenting, not offering a personal opinion, but delivering instruction meant to be received, remembered, and lived. And there is another layer in Matthew. This gospel often portrays Jesus as a teacher who brings a definitive interpretation of God's way. And many scholars have noted how Matthew's narrative invites readers to see echoes of Moses, including the way Jesus teaches from a mountain, giving a kind of new covenant instruction for the people of God. That does not mean Jesus came to erase what came before. In fact, he will explicitly say the opposite. He came to fulfill. It is addressed to disciples and also to crowds who are drawn close enough to hear what discipleship sounds like. It is guidance for real life, not a fantasy for religious idealists. If you listen closely, you will notice how the sermon moves like a river. It starts with the heart, with who is truly blessed, then moves outward to influence, to relationships, to integrity, to prayer, to priorities, and finally to a choice that cannot be avoided. The sermon does not merely tell you what to do. It tells you what kind of person you must become. And the reason this teaching pierces through time is because it addresses what every generation faces. Every generation has proud people who want power without humility. Every generation has grieving people who wonder if sorrow is the end of the story. Every generation has angry people who feel justified and lustful people who feel entitled. Every generation has anxious people chasing security and judgmental people trying to feel superior. Every generation has broken relationships, damaged words, violated trust, and a hunger for righteousness that the world cannot satisfy. Jesus speaks into all of that, not as an escape, as an invitation into the kingdom of heaven, not merely as a future destination, but as a present reality that begins reshaping you from the inside out. So, take a deep breath and lean in. You need to understand this, because the Sermon on the Mount is not simply something you hear. It is something that begins to build a new foundation under your feet. Jesus begins with the Beatitudes, and the word itself tells you what he is doing. In Christian tradition, Beatitudes refers to these opening blessings, named from the Latin phrase that begins them, "Blessed are." They are recorded in Matthew 5, and a shorter form appears in Luke in what is often called the Sermon on the Plain. But do not treat them as a poetic introduction. Jesus is announcing the value system of the kingdom of heaven. In the world, Blessing is often measured by comfort, control, recognition, and visible success. Jesus speaks blessing over people who, in the world's eyes, look like they are losing. He begins with this line, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." That phrase, poor in spirit, has been preached in 1,000 ways, sometimes poorly, because it can be misunderstood. It does not mean pretending to be weak. It does not mean hating yourself. It does not mean denying the gifts God has placed in your life. It means recognizing spiritual need. It means knowing you cannot purchase God's kingdom with moral achievement or religious performance. It means you come with empty hands. The Greek word, often translated poor in this verse, is associated with real poverty and low status, the condition of someone who does not have leverage, who cannot demand, who is not self-sufficient. So when Jesus says poor in spirit, he is describing a posture, a heart that has stopped pretending it is in control, a person who no longer says, "I will save myself." It is the beginning of everything, because the kingdom of heaven does not crash into a life already crowded with self-worship. It enters where there is room. Then Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." This is not shallow optimism. Jesus is not romanticizing pain. He is telling the truth about how God meets human sorrow. There is the mourning that comes from loss, the phone call you never wanted, the empty chair at the table, the relationship that ended, the dream that died. And there is also the mourning that comes from moral awakening. The moment you realize sin is not a mistake, not a minor flaw, but a fracture in the soul. The moment you see how your words harmed someone, how your pride poisoned love, how your compromises led you away from God. Mourning like that can feel unbearable because it strips away illusions. But Jesus says that kind of sorrow is not wasted. It leads somewhere. It becomes the pathway to comfort. Not comfort as denial, comfort as God drawing near, restoring, forgiving, reordering what sin disordered. The promise of comfort reveals the character of God as one who does not despise weakness, but comes to meet it with mercy. Then Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Meekness is one of the most misunderstood virtues in modern culture. Some people think meek means passive. Some think it means you let people walk all over you. Some think it means you never speak up, never confront, never lead. But in the moral vision of Scripture, meekness is strength under control. It is power governed by love. It is a refusal to use force to feed the ego. And notice what Jesus promises to the meek: not survival, inheritance. The meek inherit the earth. That echoes the way God's promises often work. The world grabs, the kingdom receives. The world conquers, the kingdom inherits. Then Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." This is not casual interest. Hunger and thirst are not hobbies. They are survival instincts. Jesus is describing people who crave righteousness the way a dehydrated person craves water. And righteousness here is not merely private morality. It is a word that points to right alignment with God's will, with God's justice, with God's faithfulness. It is the longing for things to be made right in your life, in your relationships, in your community, in your world. And Jesus says that longing will not end in disappointment. It will be satisfied. Then Jesus says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." Mercy is not weakness. Mercy is not pretending wrong is right. Mercy is taking the pain of someone else's brokenness seriously enough that you choose compassion instead of revenge. Mercy sees sin clearly, but refuses to treat people as disposable. Mercy does not erase boundaries, but it refuses cruelty. Mercy is the refusal to become the kind of person you hate. And Jesus ties mercy to mercy received, because the kingdom is a realm where grace flows like a river. Those who truly receive mercy become people who extend it. Then Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." Purity of heart is not the same as outward respectability. A person can look clean and be filthy inside. A person can have a spiritual vocabulary and still have a heart driven by envy, lust, greed, bitterness, and pride. Purity of heart is inner integrity. It is the wholeness of a life that is not split in two. It is when your private life and your public life belong to the same God. It is when your motives begin to match your words. And Jesus connects purity to vision. The pure in heart will see God. This is not only a future promise, it is also a present reality. A heart that is no longer addicted to darkness becomes capable of recognizing God's presence, God's guidance, God's work, even in ordinary days. Impure hearts see only what can be used. Pure hearts see what is true. Then Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God." Notice he does not say peace lovers. He says peacemakers. Peace does not happen by accident. Real peace is built. Peacemakers are not people who avoid conflict at all costs. Sometimes avoiding conflict is cowardice, not peace. Peacemakers are people who do the hard work of reconciliation, truth-telling, forgiveness, repair. And Jesus links peacemaking to identity. They will be called sons of God. In the biblical imagination, to be called a son of someone is not merely to carry their name. It is to resemble their character. So peacemakers resemble the God who reconciles, the God who moves toward enemies, not away from them. The God whose great work is not condemnation, but restoration. Then Jesus speaks the beatitude most people wish were not in the Bible. "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." This is not a blessing upon being obnoxious. This is not a blessing upon suffering consequences for your own wrongdoing. It is a blessing upon those who are opposed because they refuse to bow to evil, refuse to lie, refuse to worship what the world worships. And Jesus ties that suffering to the kingdom again, because the kingdom is not a popularity contest. It is a new reality that exposes old darkness, and darkness does not always applaud the light. But Jesus says, the kingdom belongs to those who endure, not because pain is good, but because God is faithful. Do you see what Jesus has done in just a few lines? He has overturned the world's definition of the good life. He has claimed that blessing is not reserved for the impressive. Blessing belongs to the humble, the grieving, the meek, the hunger-driven, the merciful, the pure, the peacemaking, the faithful under pressure. This is the beginning of discipleship, because discipleship begins not with self-confidence, but with surrender, not with climbing, but with kneeling, not with demanding, but with receiving. And the moment you begin to receive the kingdom like that, everything else Jesus says begins to make sense. After the Beatitudes, Jesus shifts from inner character to outer influence. He looks at his disciples and speaks identity, not merely assignment. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. In the ancient world, salt mattered. It flavored food, and it also helped preserve what would otherwise decay. Jesus is saying that kingdom-shaped people have a preserving effect in a world that is rotting from the inside. When a person lives with humility, mercy, purity, and peacemaking. That life resists corruption. It slows decay. It interrupts cycles of revenge. It restores honesty. It protects the vulnerable. It exposes hypocrisy. It gives moral flavor to a tasteless culture. But Jesus warns about something subtle. Salt can lose its saltiness. A disciple can lose distinctiveness. When the values of the world become the values of the church, the preserving agent stops preserving. When disciples stop living the Beatitudes, they still keep religious language, but their spiritual influence becomes thin, almost non-existent. Then Jesus speaks of light. Light is meant to be seen. Light removes confusion. Light helps you find your way when you would otherwise stumble. And Jesus says, a city on a hill cannot be hidden, and a lamp is not lit to be covered. The point is not attention for attention's sake. The point is that visible goodness directs people toward God. This is where many people get confused. They hear Jesus speak about letting your light shine, and they assume he is calling for performance. But Jesus is not calling for religious theater. Later in the sermon, he will explicitly warn against performing righteousness to be seen by others. So, what does it mean to shine without performing? It means you live with such integrity that your actions become credible. You love in ways that cannot be explained by ambition. You forgive in ways that cannot be explained by convenience. You serve in ways that cannot be explained by self-interest. And when people ask why, the answer is, look at God. This is why the Sermon on the Mount has often been described as a kind of Christian counterculture, a way of life that contrasts with the norms of the world around it. Jesus does not tell you to become salt and light. He says, you are salt and light. In other words, if you belong to him, influence is not optional. It is inevitable. The only question is, what kind of influence your life will have. Will your life make the world thirstier for God or more cynical? Will your life preserve what is good, or will it blend into decay? Will your life clarify what is true, or will it contribute to confusion? Will your life become a quiet argument for the beauty of holiness, or will it become a loud contradiction of the words you claim to believe? Jesus is offering more than inspiration. He is offering a calling, and that calling cannot be separated from the inner virtues of the Beatitudes. Salt and light flow from meekness, mercy, purity, and peacemaking. In the kingdom, influence comes from character, not from image, and character begins in the secret places of the heart. Now Jesus reaches a turning point. He addresses the law and the prophets, the scriptures that shaped the life of Israel, and he says something that has shaped Christian understanding ever since. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. This is vital. Jesus is not a rebel throwing out God's commands. He is the one who brings them to their true end, their true intent. Scholars note how central the Torah and its interpretation are in Matthew, and the Sermon on the Mount stands prominently as a place where Jesus clarifies what obedience looks like under the reign of God. Then Jesus says something that should make every honest person pause. Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. That is not Jesus praising perfectionism. It is Jesus confronting a kind of righteousness that is merely external. A kind of righteousness that looks holy but is hollow. A kind of righteousness that obeys the letter while violating the spirit. Jesus is moving righteousness from performance to transformation. And then he begins a series of teachings, often introduced by a pattern. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you. These teachings are sometimes called case studies in right relationships. In Matthew 5, Jesus takes commands from the Torah, then exposes the deeper intent of those commands by moving from external actions to internal roots. You have heard, do not murder. But Jesus does not stop at murder because murder begins long before a weapon appears. Murder begins when anger is cherished, when contempt becomes normal, when another human being is reduced to an obstacle. Jesus teaches that unresolved anger and contempt place you under judgment, and he urgently calls for reconciliation. If you remember that your brother has something against you, go and be reconciled. Let that sink in. Jesus is saying that worship without reconciliation is incomplete. You cannot be at peace with God while you are committed to war with your neighbor. So, the kingdom demands humility, initiative, repair. Not tomorrow, now. This is one of the most practical places where the Sermon on the Mount either becomes real or remains theoretical. Because we live in a world where anger is rewarded, rage gets clicks, outrage gathers crowds, contempt feels like strength, especially when it is directed at people you believe deserve it. But Jesus is forming a different kind of human being. A person who refuses to let anger become identity, a person who refuses to let resentment become home, a person who chooses reconciliation not because the other person earned it, but because peace matters more than pride. This is what it means to be a peacemaker in ordinary life. You do not merely avoid conflict, you move toward healing. Then Jesus moves to lust. You have heard, do not commit adultery. But Jesus goes deeper. He speaks of the heart. He says that looking with intent to lust is already a violation in the inner world, because adultery, like murder, begins long before the outward act. It begins as an inner consent, a private imagination, a repeated indulgence, a decision to treat a person as an object. Jesus speaks with seriousness here, using hyperbolic language to show urgency. He communicates that disciples must treat sin at the root, not merely on the surface, not because God is harsh, but because sin destroys. It destroys families. It destroys minds. It destroys the capacity for faithful love. And do you see what Jesus is doing? He is not teaching behavior modification. He is teaching a new vision of what human beings are for. Human beings are not made to consume each other. They are made to honor each other, to love with fidelity, to carry holiness into desire, to become whole. This is purity of heart becoming real in the modern world, where temptation is no longer occasional, but constant. Jesus is not naive about desire. He is naming its power and then calling disciples to a higher power, the power of a transformed heart. Jesus then addresses oath-taking. He warns against manipulating words to seem truthful. He calls disciples to such integrity that a simple yes is enough and a simple no is enough. In other words, the kingdom forms people whose words are reliable because their hearts are reliable. This is not only spiritual, it is relational. A community where people do not need to reinforce every statement with promises and dramatic language is a community where trust is alive. Jesus is building that kind of community. Then Jesus addresses retaliation. You have heard, eye for eye. But Jesus says, do not resist an evil person in the way the world resists. He gives examples like turning the other cheek, going the second mile, giving generously. This section is often misread either as permission to abuse victims or as a demand that Christians accept injustice quietly. But the deeper point is that the kingdom rejects vengeance as a way of life. Because vengeance spreads evil, it multiplies harm, it keeps you chained to the person who hurt you, not by love, but by obsession. Jesus is teaching disciples to refuse the spiral. to resist evil without becoming evil, to absorb insult without becoming a slave to pride, to practice generosity instead of grasping. This is how a peacemaker lives, when peace is costly. And then Jesus reaches the summit of his moral teaching. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. This is not a suggestion for unusually spiritual people. It is the logic of the kingdom. If you only love people who love you, you are not living in the kingdom. You are simply living by natural instinct. The love Jesus commands is not based on the worthiness of the other person. It is based on the character of God. Jesus points to the way God gives sun and rain, gifts that fall upon the righteous and the unrighteous. In other words, God's kindness is not merely a reward. It is an expression of who God is. This does not mean you trust abusive people. This does not mean you remove wisdom and boundaries. It means you refuse hatred. It means you refuse the kind of bitterness that turns you into what hurt you. It means you pray, because prayer is where the heart is reformed. You put the enemy into the hands of God. You ask that evil would end. You ask that repentance would come. You ask that truth would prevail. And as you pray, something begins to happen. The enemy might not change quickly, but you change. The grip of hatred loosens. The addiction to revenge weakens. The heart becomes free. Jesus then sums up what he is doing with one of the most demanding lines in the sermon. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. This line has terrified people for centuries. But in context, Jesus is pointing to the wholeness of God's love, a love that is not partial, not tribal, not limited to those who deserve it. He is calling disciples toward maturity, toward completeness, toward a holiness that is not merely ritual, but relational, a holiness that looks like love, and that reveals the shocking truth. The Sermon on the Mount is not mainly about avoiding sin. It is about becoming like the Father. It is about a life where the Beatitudes are not slogans, but a description of your growing character. Humility, mercy, purity, peacemaking, faithfulness under pressure. That is what righteousness surpassing the Pharisees looks like. Not less obedience, more depth, not less seriousness. More truth. At this point, the sermon turns to the secret places. Jesus confronts something that destroys spirituality more efficiently than open rebellion. Religious performance. He speaks about giving, prayer, and fasting, 3 pillars of visible devotion in his world. And he warns his disciples not to do them for human applause. He teaches that when you give, you should not make it a spectacle. When you pray, you should not pray to be admired. When you fast, you should not advertise it, because someone can do holy actions with an unholy motive. And the tragedy of religious performance is that it gets its reward. If you seek admiration, admiration is all you get. But if you seek the Father, you get the Father. Then Jesus teaches a prayer that has shaped Christian life across centuries. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done. Give us daily bread. Forgive us as we forgive. Lead us away from temptation and deliver us from evil. Jesus places this prayer at the center of his instruction on the inner life, and many guides to the Sermon on the Mount emphasize how it holds together God's purposes and human needs, teaching disciples to desire the reign of God while depending on God day by day. Notice what the prayer begins with. Not your problems, God's name, God's kingdom, God's will. This reorders the heart. It reminds the disciple that reality is bigger than the anxiety of today. Then the prayer moves into daily dependence, bread, forgiveness, protection. This is Jesus teaching you to live without illusions of self-sufficiency. You are not the source. God is the source. And the prayer also binds spiritual life to relational life. Forgive us as we forgive. In other words, this is not a prayer for people who want private spirituality without public transformation. Then Jesus addresses treasure. Do not store up treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. Store up treasure in heaven. This is not Jesus condemning work, planning, or responsibility. This is Jesus exposing where security really lives. Earthly treasure is unstable by nature. Economies shift, health fails, relationships change, possessions break. Even if none of that happens, death still comes. So if your soul is anchored to what can be lost, you will live in fear, even when you pretend you are fine. Jesus is not anti-joy. He is anti-illusion. He is calling you to invest your heart where it can actually be safe. Then Jesus says something that reveals how the heart works. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. You do not drift into the kingdom. Your heart follows your treasure. If your treasure is the approval of people, your heart becomes anxious and brittle. If your treasure is money, your heart becomes restless and calculating. If your treasure is power, your heart becomes hard, because power is never satisfied. But if your treasure is God, your heart becomes free. Not because life becomes easy, because the center becomes stable. And then Jesus speaks with stunning clarity. You cannot serve both God and money. He does not say it is difficult. He says it is impossible, because money makes a powerful God. It promises control, comfort, status, safety, but it always demands more. God does not demand more to starve you. God demands your whole heart to save you. So, the sermon forces a choice. What will you worship? What will you serve? Then Jesus addresses anxiety directly. He says, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, what you will wear. He points to the birds, provided for. He points to the lilies, clothed in beauty. And he says that worry cannot add a single hour to your life. This is not Jesus shaming people who struggle with anxiety. This is Jesus calling anxious hearts into the fatherhood of God. He teaches that you matter to God, and therefore you can seek God's kingdom first, trusting that what you truly need will be given in the right way, in the right time. This is where the Sermon on the Mount becomes intensely personal, because some of the loudest storms in life are not external, they are internal. The storm of fear, the storm of scarcity, the storm of imagining the future without God. Jesus is not denying storms exist. He is teaching you where to stand while they rage. Seek first the kingdom and His righteousness. That line takes you back to the Beatitudes. Hunger and thirst for righteousness. Here it is again, a life aimed at God, a life freed from obsession with what cannot save you. This is discipleship in the secret place, not a public image, a heart that prays when no one sees, a generosity that expects no applause, a fasting that does not become a badge, a trust that refuses to panic, because the Father is real and the kingdom is near. In Matthew 7, Jesus turns again toward relationships and discernment, and His words are so famous that even people who have never opened the Bible know fragments of them. Judge not, that you be not judged. These words are frequently misunderstood as a command to abandon moral discernment. But context matters. The point is not that you should never recognize evil. The point is that you should never put yourself in the position of a self-righteous judge who condemns others while ignoring your own corruption. Jesus uses an image that is both humorous and devastating. He speaks of a person with a plank in their eye trying to remove a speck from someone else's eye. He exposes the absurdity of hypocrisy, and he calls for self-examination first. Get the plank out of your own eye. Then you will see clearly to help your brother. Notice something. Jesus does not forbid helping your brother. He forbids arrogant, hypocritical judgment. He calls for humility, clarity, and a kind of mercy that tells the truth without cruelty. This is beatitude living, poor in spirit, merciful, pure in heart, peacemaking. These virtues show up again, not as poetry, but as wisdom for relationships that would otherwise collapse under pride. Then Jesus speaks about prayer again. Ask and it will be given. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened. He is not teaching a vending machine God. He is teaching persistence in dependence. A disciple is not a person who learns a few principles and then graduates from need. A disciple is someone who keeps coming, keeps asking, keeps seeking, keeps knocking, not because God is reluctant, but because relationship is formed through return. And Jesus grounds this call to prayer in the goodness of the Father. If earthly parents give bread instead of stones, how much more will your Father give good gifts? This is the kingdom again. Not only commands, but a Father behind the commands. Then Jesus offers what many call the golden rule. Do to others what you would have them do to you. And he says that this sums up the law and the prophets. This connects directly to what he said earlier about fulfilling the law and the prophets. He is not discarding Scripture. He is revealing its center. The center is love expressed as neighbor-focused action, not sentimental feeling. Action, the kind of action that requires imagination. What would I want if I were them? If I were the one overlooked? If I were the one misunderstood? If I were the one grieving? If I were the one tempted? If I were the one trying to start over? Do to others what you would want done to you. That is righteousness made practical. Then Jesus makes the sermon narrow. He speaks of a gate, a wide gate that is easy, and a narrow gate that leads to life. This is not Jesus being cruel. This is Jesus being honest. The sermon cannot be reduced to general inspiration because it demands transformation. And transformation is always narrower than self-indulgence. The wide road is easy because it requires nothing. You can stay proud. You can stay bitter. You can stay lustful. You can stay anxious. You can stay greedy. You can stay performative. You can keep judging others to avoid facing yourself. The wide road never asks you to die to the old self. The narrow road does. And the narrow road is where life is found. Jesus also warns about false prophets, people whose words sound spiritual, but whose lives produce rotten fruit. He says you will recognize them by their fruit. This matters because a major theme of the Sermon on the Mount is integrity. Not just speaking truth, but living truth. Not just appearing righteous, but becoming righteous. Not just calling Jesus Lord, but doing the will of the Father. These warnings are not meant to make faithful disciples paranoid. They are meant to call faithless religion to repentance. Because religion without transformation is not safety. It is danger. It teaches you to say the right words while remaining unchanged. Finally, Jesus ends the sermon with a parable that makes everything unmistakably clear. Two people hear his words. One builds a house on rock. The other builds a house on sand. Storms come, rain falls, floods rise, winds beat against the houses. One stands. The other collapses. The difference is not whether storms come. Storms come to both. The difference is foundation. Jesus says the wise person is the one who hears these words and does them. The foolish person hears and does not do. In other words, the sermon demands response, not admiration, obedience, not agreement, practice, not inspiration, construction. This is why the Sermon on the Mount is so powerful and so frightening, because it does not allow you to hide behind identity labels. It forces you to build, and what you build will be tested. So here is the final invitation. Do not treat the sermon like ancient literature. Treat it like a mirror. Let it show you where your heart is proud, where your anger has been justified for too long, where your desires have been undisciplined, where your words have been careless, where your devotion has been performative, where your treasure has been misplaced, where your worry has ruled you, where your judgments have been hypocritical. And then, do not run from what you see. Bring it into the light, because Jesus did not preach this sermon to crush you. He preached it to call you into life, the kind of life where humility is strength, where mourning leads to comfort, where meekness becomes inheritance, where hunger for righteousness becomes satisfaction, where mercy flows and mercy returns, where purity of heart becomes vision, where peacemaking becomes identity, where persecution does not destroy hope, where salt preserves and light shines, where prayer becomes daily breath, where treasure becomes eternal, where storms come and you stand. You need to understand this. The Sermon on the Mount is not a burden placed on you. It is a foundation offered to you. And the moment you stop treating it as information and start treating it as truth to be lived, you will discover something most people never discover. Peace is not the absence of chaos. Peace is the presence of God in a life rebuilt around the kingdom. Before we go deeper, hold three simple images in your mind: a mountain and a crowd leaning forward to listen, a lamp lifted high that refuses to be hidden, a house anchored to rock while a storm tries and fails to move it. These images will return again and again because they are the shape of this message. Now listen, you do not need more noise. You do not need 100 new opinions. You need a foundation. You need a way to live that does not crumble the moment life gets hard. You need to understand this. When Jesus sat down on that hillside, He did not offer a cozy spirituality for private comfort. He announced the kingdom of God as the truest reality in the world. He spoke blessing into places the world calls failure. He spoke integrity into a culture addicted to performance. He spoke reconciliation into a society trained for revenge. He spoke purity into desires that had been running wild for generations. He spoke trust into anxious hearts that had learned to survive by worrying. He spoke a new kind of righteousness, not just rules on the hands, but a new heart. And the first thing you must remember is that Jesus spoke these words in a real place, to real people, under real pressure. Imagine a village morning in Galilee. The sun rises, and the light touches stone homes and narrow paths. You can hear roosters and sandals against dirt. You can smell bread from an oven and fish carried from the lake. A woman fills a jar with water. A man checks a field. A child runs between adults who already look tired. But there is a weight on the day that most tourists would never notice. There are soldiers not far away. There are officials. There are systems. There are taxes. There are debts. There are landlords. There are families who lost land that once belonged to their grandparents. There are people who feel squeezed by forces they cannot control. There are people who feel powerless, and some who feel angry enough to explode. In that world, Rome is not just a distant empire. Rome is a shadow over everything. Some regions are ruled through client kings. Other regions are administered by Roman officials. Some areas are Jewish and some are Gentile. And daily life includes the tension of living side by side with different customs, different loyalties, different fears. Languages overlap. Aramaic is the language of home for many. Greek appears in trade and broader public life. And because honor is public in a culture like this, reputation is not a private preference. It is survival. A word spoken about you can raise you or ruin you. A public insult can become a family wound that lasts for decades. Now imagine the religious landscape. Some leaders believe strict law-keeping will bring God's deliverance. Some believe cooperation with power is the only way to keep peace. Some run to the hills, convinced violence will set them free. Some withdraw, waiting for purity in the desert while the world rots. And most people are simply trying to get through the week without losing hope. So, when Jesus climbs a hill and begins to speak, he is not speaking into a vacuum. He is speaking into a world where people are hungry for rescue, but confused about what rescue looks like. And he begins with the Beatitudes. He begins with blessing. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted. In other words, blessed are the people you would not put on a poster. Can you feel how shocking that would be in that world? In a world where honor is everything, Jesus speaks honor over the humble. In a world where strength is admired, he speaks inheritance over the meek. In a world where pain is hidden, he speaks comfort over the grieving. In a world where vengeance is normal, he speaks identity over peacemakers. In a world where purity is often reduced to external rules, he speaks of a heart clean enough to see God. You need to understand this. Jesus is not just describing spiritual moods. He is describing a new kind of human being. He is describing the kind of person the kingdom creates. So, let me give you a simple exercise before we go further, because history only matters if it helps you listen better. First, picture the hill and the crowd, not as a painting, but as a scene you can smell and hear. Imagine the dust. Imagine the hunger. Imagine someone listening who is worried about rent, worried about illness, worried about a child, worried about what Rome will demand next. Now imagine Jesus speaking blessing over them. Second, ask yourself one question. Where do I feel occupied? Where do I feel ruled by forces I did not choose? Where do I feel squeezed? It could be financial pressure. It could be family expectations. It could be shame. It could be addiction. It could be anger. It could be anxiety. Name it honestly. Third, pray a simple prayer in your own words. God, teach me the kind of life that cannot be occupied from the inside. Teach me the kingdom life. Take heart. If Jesus could speak hope into that world, he can speak hope into yours. The kingdom is not fragile. It is not a theory. It is a living reality that begins inside a human heart. Now we move from the world around Jesus to the world inside you, because the sermon always moves there. It always goes for the roots. And one of the first roots Jesus touches is grief. Imagine a modern scene. A hospital hallway, fluorescent lights that never change, a vending machine humming in the corner. Someone stares at a phone, scrolling through messages with trembling hands because they do not know what else to do. A doctor has just said a sentence that feels like a door closing, then silence, then the heavy realization that life will not be the same. Or imagine something quieter. A kitchen table at midnight. A person sits alone with bills, not because they are irresponsible, but because life hit them hard. A job ended. A relationship ended. A dream ended. They do not have words for it, but inside, they are mourning. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." That line is not a denial of pain. It is an invitation to bring pain into the presence of God. Here is what you need to understand about grief. Grief is not a staircase. It is not a straight line. It moves back and forth. Some days you feel functional, and you can laugh, and you can work, and you can even enjoy a meal. Then the next day, a smell, a song, a memory hits you, and you feel like you are back at the beginning. That does not mean you are failing. That means you are human. There is a rhythm in healthy grieving. Sometimes you are facing the loss directly. You are crying. You are remembering. You are admitting what is gone. Other times, you are doing the work of living. You are paying bills, making meals, answering emails, taking care of children. You do not heal by living in only one of those modes. You heal by moving between them. Now listen carefully. The Sermon on the Mount does not ask you to pretend you are strong. It blesses those who mourn. It honors honesty. It says that tears are not disqualifying. Tears can be a doorway because mourning can also be spiritual. There is the grief of loss, and there is the grief of recognizing your own sin. There is the grief of seeing the harm you have done, the grief of seeing how anger became contempt, how desire became distortion, how pride became a wall, how you tried to build on sand and it collapsed. That kind of mourning can feel like death, but it is also, strangely, the beginning of life, because it is the moment you stop lying to yourself. It is the moment you become poor in spirit, not in performance, but in reality. Empty hands, honest heart. And Jesus says comfort will come. Comfort does not always come as immediate relief. Sometimes, comfort comes as presence. The presence of God in the valley. Sometimes comfort comes as community. Someone who sits with you without fixing you. Sometimes comfort comes as a slow rebuilding. A new ability to breathe. A new ability to hope. Now we have to talk about anger, because grief and anger often live in the same house. Imagine a simple moment. You are driving. Someone cuts you off. Your body tightens. Your jaw clenches. You mutter words you would not want your child to repeat. And later you realize the reaction was bigger than the moment. The moment touched something deeper, something stored. Anger is not always sin. Sometimes anger is a signal. It can signal that something is wrong, that something is broken. But anger becomes dangerous when it becomes a home, when it becomes identity, when it turns into contempt. Jesus goes straight for that. He says, "You have heard that murder is wrong, but I tell you, anger and contempt are the seeds of murder." The act begins in the heart, long before the hand moves. Here is a psychological truth that harmonizes with spiritual wisdom. Anger grows when it is fed by rumination. When you replay the offense, when you rehearse the argument, when you keep building a case in your mind, rumination feels like control, but it is actually a cage. It keeps the wound open. It keeps the nervous system activated. It keeps your imagination trapped in the past. Jesus calls you out of that cage through reconciliation. Reconciliation does not mean you pretend nothing happened. Reconciliation means you pursue repair with truth and humility. Sometimes you pursue repair through a conversation, sometimes through a letter, sometimes through confession and boundaries, sometimes the other person refuses, and you cannot force them, but you can refuse to let hatred rule you. Now we need to talk about forgiveness, because forgiveness is where many people get confused, and confusion here can cause real harm. Forgiveness is not the same as approval. Forgiveness is not calling evil good. Forgiveness is not forgetting trauma. Forgiveness is not immediate feelings of warmth towards someone who harmed you. Forgiveness is a decision to release your right to revenge into the hands of God. And sometimes, forgiveness happens in layers. You forgive, then a month later the memory returns, and you realize there is another layer. You forgive again. That does not mean your first forgiveness was fake. It means the wound was deep. Forgiveness is also not the same as reconciliation. Reconciliation requires repentance and safety and rebuild trust. Forgiveness can happen even when trust cannot. Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That is not sentimental. That is warfare against hatred. Because hatred will make you like what you hate. Hatred will train your mind to see people as objects. Hatred will turn your heart hard. Hatred will teach you to justify cruelty. Hatred will poison your prayer life. So Jesus gives you a better way. Pray, not because prayer is magic, but because prayer relocates the battle. You stop fighting your enemy as if you are God. You place the enemy in God's hands. You ask for justice. You ask for mercy. You ask for truth. You ask for transformation. And as you pray, your heart changes. Now here are practical exercises, because you cannot merely admire this. You need practice. First, for grief, choose one small ritual of remembrance and one small ritual of restoration. A ritual of remembrance could be lighting a candle and speaking the person's name, or writing a letter you do not send, or reading a psalm of lament. A ritual of restoration could be a walk, a meal with a trusted friend, or a small act of service. Do both, not forever, just for 7 days. Learn the rhythm. Second, for anger, practice the holy pause. When you feel anger rise, pause for 10 seconds. Take one slow breath. Name what is underneath. Is it fear? Is it shame? Is it exhaustion? Is it grief? Then choose one response that moves toward peace rather than escalation. It might be silence. It might be a calm sentence. It might be stepping away to pray. Third, for forgiveness, write a simple declaration in your own words. It could be as short as this: God, I release my right to revenge. I will not carry this as a weapon. Help me choose mercy without denying truth. Then, read that declaration once a day for 2 weeks. Let your heart catch up to your will. Now, a short pastoral encouragement, because some of you are listening with heavy wounds. Take heart. The kingdom does not require you to heal instantly. It invites you to bring your pain into the light. Jesus does not bless denial. He blesses mourning. He does not bless explosive anger. He blesses peacemaking. He does not bless hatred. He blesses mercy. And He does not leave you alone to do this. The Father sees you, and the grace of God is not exhausted by your struggle. Now that we have talked about the inner world, we need to bring the Beatitudes into the places you actually live. Because the Sermon on the Mount is not meant to stay in church language. It is meant to walk into kitchens, offices, schools, and neighborhoods. Imagine a family evening. Two parents, tired. A child spills a drink. Someone raises their voice too quickly. Someone else feels disrespected. Within 30 seconds, the atmosphere changes. You can feel the surge. You can feel the temptation to win, to be right, to punish, to withdraw. This is where the Beatitudes either become poetry or become power. Blessed are the poor in spirit. In the family, that means you say, I was wrong. Not as a performance, as reality. You stop defending. You stop explaining. You stop building a courtroom in your mind. You become humble. Blessed are the meek. In the family, that means you do not use volume as authority. You do not use intimidation as leadership. You do not use sarcasm as superiority. Meekness is strength under control. It is the power to stay steady when emotions are loud. Blessed are the merciful. In the family, that means you do not keep a record of wrongs like a weapon. You do not replay old failures to crush someone today. You address what is real, but you do not become cruel. Blessed are the peacemakers. In the family, that means you pursue repair quickly. You do not let resentment become furniture in the house. You do not let silence become punishment. You initiate reconciliation. Now imagine a moment that tests purity of heart. A spouse feels unseen. A person begins to daydream about someone else, not because they want to destroy their marriage, but because they are lonely and tired, and the mind is looking for escape. That is where Jesus' teaching about the heart becomes a rescue rather than a condemnation. Purity of heart is not only about avoiding scandal, it is about restoring wholeness. It is bringing desire under the authority of love. It is remembering that a person is not an object. It is remembering that covenant love is not built by emotion alone, but nourished by devotion, truth, tenderness, and repentance. So here is a family case study, not as a fairy tale, but as the kind of scene many of you know. A husband comes home late again. His wife has been carrying the day. Dinner, homework, laundry, work emails, emotional labor. He walks in and says he is exhausted. She hears it as dismissal. Her voice rises. He hears it as attack. He retreats. She follows. He shuts down. She becomes louder. He becomes colder. Then the children disappear into their rooms because they have learned to survive conflict by hiding. Now imagine a different moment. The same day, the same fatigue, but someone remembers the sermon. The wife takes a breath and says, I am not angry only about today. I am lonely. I feel unseen. I need you to hear me. The husband swallows pride and says, I have been absent. I am sorry. I want to learn. Help me understand what you are carrying. That is poor in spirit. That is meekness. That is peacemaking. That is mercy. Not perfect, but real. Now here are practical exercises for family life, because you need steps. First, practice the daily confession of weakness. Once a day, say one sentence out loud that begins with, I need patience. I need wisdom. I need help loving well. This trains poverty of spirit. It kills pride gently. Second, practice one act of hidden mercy. Do something kind for a family member without announcing it, without expecting praise. Clean something. Write a note. Apologize first. Mercy becomes a habit through repetition. Third, practice reconciliation before sleep. If there is conflict, do not let it sit for days. You do not need to solve everything at midnight, but you can say, "I love you. I am committed to peace. We will talk tomorrow with calm." Then pray a simple prayer together, even if it is awkward. A short, pastoral encouragement. Your home can change, not because you will suddenly become flawless, but because the kingdom grows like seed, small, steady, hidden. Over time, the atmosphere shifts. The children notice. The walls learn a new sound, the sound of humility, the sound of forgiveness, the sound of peace. Now move from the home to the workplace, because many of you spend most of your waking hours there. This is where salt and light are tested. Imagine a typical Monday: emails, meetings, pressure, deadlines. A supervisor who measures you by output, not by your soul. A colleague who gossips. A culture that rewards ambition. A system that tempts you to compromise. Jesus says you are salt and light. That is not just a compliment. It is a responsibility. Salt preserves. Light reveals. But what does that look like in an office where people are stressed and trust is thin? It looks like integrity when lying would be easier. It looks like restraint when anger would be celebrated. It looks like excellence without ego. It looks like refusing to participate in humiliation, even when the humiliated person is unpopular. It looks like protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them. Now, a workplace case study. A young employee discovers that numbers are being adjusted to impress investors. Nothing dramatic, just a small manipulation. A quick edit, a quiet lie. Everyone acts like it is normal. The employee feels a heat in the stomach. Fear. If I speak, I could lose my job. If I stay silent, I become part of it. This is hunger and thirst for righteousness in modern life. Righteousness is not only about private morality. It is about right relationships, truth, justice, faithfulness. It is about doing right by others, including the people who will be harmed by dishonest systems. So, what does the sermon say? It says your treasure reveals your heart. If your treasure is approval, you will stay silent. If your treasure is money, you will compromise. If your treasure is the kingdom, you will seek righteousness, even when it costs you. Now that does not mean you act foolishly. The sermon does not bless recklessness, it blesses wisdom. So the young employee seeks counsel. They document facts. They speak up through proper channels. They refuse to be manipulated into being the scapegoat. They choose truth with courage and humility. That is salt. That is light. Now, a public life case study, because we live in an age where public life often feels like a battlefield. Imagine a social media thread. Someone insults your belief. Someone mocks your faith. Someone generalizes and says, all Christians are hypocrites. Your body reacts. Your fingers want to type. You want to win. You want to crush. You want to be admired by your side. Then you remember Jesus saying, "Blessed are the peacemakers. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Let your light shine so people see your good works and glorify the Father." So you respond differently. You refuse contempt. You answer with clarity, not cruelty. You admit failures where they are real. You ask questions. You bless rather than curse. You step away rather than living in rage. That is not weakness. That is freedom. Now, practical exercises for workplace and public life. First, choose one boundary that protects your integrity. If gossip is constant, Decide one sentence you will use. I do not want to speak about them when they are not here. If dishonesty is normal, decide one line you will not cross, and decide it now before pressure hits. Second, choose one practice of light. Light is not only exposing darkness. Light is doing good openly enough that it becomes an invitation. Encourage a colleague. Mentor someone. Overlooked. Give credit. Protect a subordinate. Tell the truth in a gentle way. Third, choose one practice of peacemaking in public life. Before you comment, ask yourself, will this produce peace or heat? Will this build bridges or build walls? Will this sound like Jesus? If not, do not type. Pray. A short pastoral encouragement. You are not powerless in a toxic culture. Small acts of righteousness matter. Quiet integrity matters. Mercy matters. The kingdom comes through ordinary disciples who refuse to be shaped by the world's rage. Now we return to the secret place, because Jesus returns there. He says the most dangerous form of religion is the kind that looks holy but is hollow. You can give and still be greedy. You can pray and still be proud. You can fast and still hunger for applause. So Jesus teaches spiritual disciplines as formation, not as theater. Imagine a person who has done religious things for years. They know how to look spiritual. They know how to use spiritual words. But inside, they feel dry, they feel hollow, they feel like faith is a costume. Then one day they turn off the music, close the door, and speak honestly. God, I do not even know how to pray anymore. I feel empty. I feel tired. I feel distracted. I feel ashamed. That is poor in spirit. That is the beginning. Jesus teaches you to pray to the Father, who sees in secret. He teaches you to ask, seek, knock. He teaches you to pray for God's name to be honored, God's kingdom to come, God's will to be done. He teaches you to ask for daily bread, forgiveness, protection from temptation. In other words, prayer is not a performance. Prayer is dependence. And fasting, when practiced wisely, is a way to train desire. It is a way to say to the body, you are not my master. It is a way to say to the heart, God is my treasure. And giving is a way to loosen the grip of greed. It is a way to tell your money where it belongs, under the kingdom. Now, pastoral guidance for formation needs to be clear, because many people either avoid disciplines or turn them into legalism. So listen carefully. Spiritual disciplines are not how you earn God's love. They are how you receive God's life. They are not a ladder you climb to reach God. They are a doorway you open because God is already near. So here are practical steps for prayer, fasting, and generosity that are realistic. First, practice the 5-minute prayer that is honest. Set a timer for 5 minutes. Begin with one sentence of worship. God, you are here. Then, one sentence of confession. I have been anxious, or I have been angry, or I have been distracted. Then one sentence of request. Give me daily bread. Then one sentence of surrender. Your will be done in me. Then sit in silence for the remaining time, even if it feels awkward. Let your nervous system learn stillness. Second, practice a simple fast that trains desire without harm. Choose one thing that feeds distraction. It could be social media, streaming, snacks, constant news. Fast from that. One thing for 24 hours once a week for 4 weeks. During the craving, do not shame yourself. Just notice it, name it, pray. Replace it with scripture reading, a walk, or silence. This is not punishment. This is training. Third, practice hidden generosity. Decide on a small amount you can give regularly, even if it is modest. Give it quietly. Support a person, a church, a ministry, a need. Do not announce it. Let the Father see it. Then once a month, do one act of generosity that surprises you, something that stretches you just enough to remind you that the kingdom is more valuable than comfort. A short pastoral encouragement. If you feel dry, you are not disqualified. Dryness can be an invitation. Begin small. Be consistent. The Father sees you. The kingdom grows in secret long before it becomes visible. Now we need to talk about justice, because the sermon does not allow you to separate personal holiness from social righteousness. Jesus blesses those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. That hunger is not only internal, it becomes public. Imagine a city street. A person sleeps under a blanket near a storefront. People step around them like an inconvenience. A teenager sits on a curb, eyes blank, because home is not safe. A mother works 2 jobs and still cannot afford basic needs. An elderly man is alone. A refugee family feels invisible. Now imagine a Christian who reads the sermon and says, "My faith is private. I do not want to think about systems. I only want personal peace." Listen, Jesus offers personal peace, but he does not offer private selfishness. Salt and light have public impact. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Light reveals what is hidden. And when you begin to hunger for righteousness, you begin to see what is wrong, not just in you, but around you. Now this is where we must be careful. The sermon is not a partisan manifesto. It is not a simple set of policies. It is deeper than that. It forms the kind of people who can pursue justice without becoming hateful. It forms the kind of people who can confront oppression without becoming oppressors. It forms the kind of people who can speak truth without losing mercy. So what are the ethical implications for justice and public life? First, the sermon calls for truth. No manipulative oaths. Let your yes be yes. Let your no be no. Imagine what that would do in public discourse. Imagine what that would do in business. Imagine what that would do in families. Truth becomes a public good. Second, the sermon calls for mercy. Blessed are the merciful. Mercy disrupts cruelty. Mercy insists that people are not disposable. That has implications for how we treat the poor, the prisoner, the addict, the immigrant, the enemy. Third, the sermon calls for peacemaking. Peacemaking is not pacifying. It is repairing. It is addressing root causes. It is building systems that reduce harm and increase dignity. Fourth, the sermon calls for resisting evil without becoming evil. That changes how you protest, how you argue, how you advocate. You refuse vengeance. You refuse dehumanization. You refuse the seduction of hatred. So what can you do? You are one person, but the kingdom often begins with one person doing small, faithful things. Here are practical exercises for justice shaped by the sermon. First, practice proximity. Choose one local place where suffering is visible and go there regularly. A food pantry, a shelter, a mentoring program, a community center, not as a savior, but as a neighbor. Learn names. Listen. Let hunger for righteousness become personal, not abstract. Second, practice truthful consumption. Ask simple questions about your own life. Who is harmed by the way I spend money? Who benefits? Where can I choose fairness? Where can I choose simplicity? Treasure and heart are connected. Move your treasure toward the kingdom. Third, practice civic humility and courage. Participate in public life with a clean heart. Seek truth, reject propaganda, resist contempt, advocate for the vulnerable, vote with conscience, speak with respect. This does not mean you will always agree with other believers, but it means you refuse to worship politics. You worship God. That keeps you free. A short pastoral encouragement. Do not despise small faithfulness. A cup of water matters. A truthful word matters. A consistent presence matters. A refusal to dehumanize matters. The kingdom may not come through flashy power, but it comes through faithful people who hunger for righteousness and stay merciful while they pursue it. Now we need to talk about leadership, because leadership is one of the greatest tests of what you truly believe. Leadership reveals your heart. Imagine a meeting room. A leader sits at the head of the table. People are tense because a project failed. Money was lost. Reputation is at stake. The leader has a choice. They can blame, they can intimidate. They can protect their image by crushing someone else, or they can be meek. Meekness is misunderstood, but Jesus blesses it. The meek inherit the earth. Meekness in leadership is not passivity. It is strength under control. It is power that refuses ego. It is authority used to serve. And this is where servant leadership becomes a modern phrase for an ancient truth. A servant leader leads by prioritizing the well-being and growth of others, not because they are weak, but because they understand what leadership is for. Leadership shaped by the sermon looks like this. The leader is poor in spirit. They know they are not God. They listen. They admit mistakes. The leader is merciful. They correct without humiliating. They hold standards without cruelty. The leader is pure in heart. They do not use people as tools for ambition. They do not manipulate. The leader is a peacemaker. They address conflict directly. They do not triangulate. They do not reward gossip. They pursue reconciliation. The leader hungers for righteousness. They refuse corruption. They build systems of fairness in their sphere. Now, a leadership case study. A manager discovers that one team member is underperforming. The manager is frustrated because the performance is affecting everyone. The manager could shame the person publicly to send a message, but the manager remembers the sermon. So, the manager meets privately. The manager listens. They ask, "What is happening?" They discover the person is caring for a sick parent and is overwhelmed. This does not erase responsibility, but it changes the approach. The manager creates a plan, clear expectations, support, accountability, mercy, and truth together. That is leadership shaped by the kingdom. Now, practical exercises for servant leadership and meekness. First, practice the discipline of speaking last. In meetings, ask questions first. Listen fully. Let others contribute. Then speak. This trains humility and it increases wisdom. Second, practice shared credit. Whenever something goes well, name the people who contributed. Do it publicly. This kills ego and builds trust. Third, practice courageous truth paired with mercy. If you must correct someone, do it privately, clearly, and without contempt. Focus on behavior, not worth. Invite growth. Offer help, then follow through. A short pastoral encouragement. If you are in leadership, you are not doomed to copy the world's power games. You can lead like Jesus. You can be firm without being harsh. You can be strong without being prideful. You can be meek and still be effective. The kingdom does not remove authority. It redeems it. Now we move into one of the most difficult and most urgent areas of modern discipleship: purity of heart. Because many people are trying to follow Jesus while living in an environment designed to hijack desire. Imagine a person alone late at night. The house is quiet, the mind is restless, the phone is glowing. Images appear, suggestions appear. One click becomes 10. 10 becomes an hour. The person tells themselves it is harmless, it is private. No one knows. Then the next morning, they feel shame. They feel split. They feel like two people, one person who wants God and another person who wants to be consumed by desire. Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." Purity of heart is not mere avoidance. It is wholeness. It is a heart not divided by secret addiction. And Jesus speaks about lust in a way that is both severe and merciful. Severe because he knows how destructive it is. Merciful because he goes for the root so you can be healed. Now here is a practical truth you need to understand. Temptation is not only fought in the moment of temptation, it is fought in the environment you build and the habits you practice. Many habits are triggered automatically by cues: time of day, emotional state, location, device, boredom, loneliness, stress. When you recognize cues, you can change patterns. You can interrupt the loop. Jesus speaks of the eye and the heart. He says, the eye is like a lamp. What you feed your eyes shapes your inner world. What you treasure shapes your heart. So purity of heart includes what you look at. It includes what you imagine. It includes what you repeatedly consume. But listen carefully. Purity is not achieved by shame. Shame does not purify. Shame hides. Purity is pursued through truth, repentance, accountability, and replacement. So here are practical exercises for purity of heart and resisting temptation. First, map your triggers. For 1 week, notice when temptation is strongest. Ask simple questions. What time? What emotion? What place? What stress? Name patterns. This is not to condemn yourself. It is to understand yourself. Second, remove easy access. If your phone is the portal, change your environment. Put the phone outside the bedroom at night. Use filters. Delete apps that feed the hunger. Reduce the stream. This is what Jesus means when he speaks metaphorically about radical measures. He is saying, take temptation seriously enough to change your environment. Third, practice replacement, not just resistance. When you remove a habit, you must replace it with a better one, or the empty space will pull you back. Replace late-night scrolling with a book. Replace porn with prayer and a walk. Replace fantasy with gratitude. Replace isolation with a phone call to a trusted friend. Replacement is not magic. It is practice. Fourth, practice confession and accountability. Confession is not humiliation. Confession is bringing darkness into light, so it loses power. Find a mature, trusted person. Speak honestly. Ask for prayer. Ask for check-ins. Purity grows in community because temptation thrives in secrecy. Fifth, practice beauty and worship, not as entertainment, but as formation. Your heart will always hunger. The question is what it will hunger for. Feed your heart scripture. Feed your heart worship. Feed your heart acts of service. Over time, desire changes. A short pastoral encouragement. If you have been fighting this battle for years, do not lose heart. Victory is often built in small, faithful choices, repeated over time. You are not defined by your worst moments. You are invited into wholeness. The pure in heart will see God. That promise is not for the already perfect. It is for those who keep turning toward the light. Now we move into the final reflection, because everything we have said so far could remain individualistic if we are not careful. Jesus did not only call individuals, he formed a community, a city on a hill, a people who practice mercy and peacemaking together. Imagine a church community that looks healthy on Sunday but fractured on Monday. People sing, but they do not reconcile. People pray, but they carry grudges. People give, but they gossip. People talk about love, but they do not practice it when conflict arrives. Then a storm hits, a scandal, a financial crisis, a wave of sickness, a tragedy, a political conflict. Anxiety rises. People choose sides. Rumors spread. The community begins to crack. This is what Jesus means when he ends with the house on rock and the house on sand. Storms reveal foundations. Now listen, because this matters. The foundation is not religious activity. The foundation is hearing and doing. Doing what? Doing the beatitudes in community. Doing mercy. Doing reconciliation. Doing truth. Doing peacemaking. Doing generosity. Doing prayer. Doing purity. Doing love of enemies. Doing trust instead of anxiety. How do you build resilient communities that practice this? You build them through shared habits, shared rhythms, shared commitments. A resilient kingdom community has a culture of confession, not nonstop guilt, but honest humility. People do not pretend. They become poor in spirit together. A resilient kingdom community has a culture of repair. When harm happens, it is addressed, not hidden, not minimized, not weaponized. Addressed with truth and mercy. A resilient kingdom community has a culture of mercy for the weak. The grieving are not ignored. The struggling are not shamed. The poor are not treated as charity projects. They are treated as family. A resilient kingdom community has a culture of peacemaking. Conflict is expected, but it is handled with wisdom. People refuse triangulation. They refuse gossip. They go to the person. They seek reconciliation. A resilient kingdom community has a culture of formation. People do not only attend, they practice, they pray, they learn, they fast wisely, they give, they serve, they become salt and light together. Now a community case study. Two members of a small group misunderstand each other. One makes a comment that sounds insulting. The other becomes cold. They avoid each other. The group feels tension, but no one names it. Weeks pass. The tension grows. Then a second conflict happens, and suddenly the group splits. That is sand. Now imagine a different response. Someone in the group notices and gently says, "I sense something between you two. Can we talk and seek peace?" The offended person names the hurt without attacking. The other person listens without defensiveness. They clarify, they apologize where needed. They forgive. The group prays. The group learns. The relationship becomes stronger than before. That is rock. So, here are practical exercises for building resilient, mercy-based communities. First, practice communal confession once a month. In a small group or close community, create a safe rhythm. Each person answers one prompt. Where did pride show up in me this month? Where did anxiety rule me? Where do I need to seek reconciliation? Then pray for each other. This builds humility and trust. Second, practice the rule of direct communication. Make it a covenant. If you have an issue with someone, you do not speak to everyone else first. You speak to them. If you need counsel, you seek it discreetly, not as gossip. This one rule can change the health of a community. Third, practice shared mercy projects. Once a month, serve together. Not as a branding moment, as a habit, a visit, a meal, a need. Mercy becomes culture through repetition. Fourth, practice peacemaking training. Teach people how to apologize. Teach people how to listen. Teach people how to repair. Many adults were never taught these skills. The sermon calls you to them. Practice phrases like, "I was wrong. I hurt you. Will you forgive me? Help me understand how this affected you." What would repair look like? Fifth, practice shared simplicity and generosity. Treasure shapes heart. When a community is driven by consumerism, it becomes fragile. When a community practices generosity, it becomes strong. Encourage small, shared practices. Support those in crisis. Give quietly. Provide meals. Share resources. Let the kingdom become tangible. Kingdom become tangible. Now, a short pastoral encouragement, and then we will close with the final call. If you have been hurt by community before, I know these words can feel risky, but the answer to broken community is not isolation. The answer is redeemed community. The kingdom does not erase pain, it transforms it. The peacemakers will be called children of God. Mercy will be shown to the merciful. The pure in heart will see God. These are not slogans. They are promises for a people willing to build on rock. So here is the final call, the call Jesus ends with. Storms are coming. They come for the religious and the non-religious. They come for the moral and the immoral. They come for the rich and the poor. They come for the confident and the anxious. Storms do not ask permission. The only question is foundation. Will you build your life on sand, on moods, on approval, on money, on revenge, on lust, on performance, on anxiety? Or will you build on rock, on the words of Jesus, heard and done? You need to understand this. Hearing without doing is not neutral. It is building on sand. Admiring the sermon without practicing it is not safety. It is vulnerability. So begin today, not with grand promises, but with one act of obedience. Choose one act of mercy. Choose one apology. Choose one boundary for purity. Choose one generous gift. Choose one enemy to pray for. Choose one anxious thought to surrender. Choose one truthful word when lying would be easier. And when you fail, do not run into shame. Run back into the kingdom. Become poor in spirit again. Mourn again. Receive comfort again. Return again. The path of discipleship is not perfection. It is faithful returning. The mountain is still there. The words are still there. The lamp is still meant to shine. The house is still being built, and the Father still sees you. Build on rock.